One decision. That's all it took to destroy an entire race before it even began. Max Verstappen didn't crash. He didn't make a mistake. He didn't even drive. And yet, he was pushed from a strong position straight into the most dangerous zone on the most unforgiving track in the world. From 6th to 9th. 3 places. That sounds small. But at Nürburgring, that's the difference between control and chaos. And just 25 minutes into the race, 7 cars were involved in a massive crash, the track was shut down, and everything stopped. Completely. Now here's the part that should make you question everything. That penalty wasn't even for Verstappen. It came from his teammate. A completely different driver. A completely different moment. And still, it changed his race entirely. This isn't just unfair. It's something deeper. Because when you look closely, that single decision didn't just affect the grid. It may have placed a Formula One world champion directly in the path of disaster. And once you understand how that happened, you'll see why this isn't just a penalty. It's a warning. It looked like nothing. No headlines. No outrage. No immediate reaction from the crowd. Just a quiet message from the stewards, almost routine, almost automatic. A 3-place grid penalty. Simple. Clean. Final. But that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because the decisions that change everything in motorsport are rarely the loud ones. They're the ones that slip through unnoticed. The ones that feel normal. This one came from a moment most people never even saw. Qualifying. Traffic. Lucas hour, pushing through a section where speed differences are not just large, they're extreme. Cars from completely different categories sharing the same space. Some braking earlier. Some arriving much faster than expected. And in that chaos, a miscalculation. A Porsche ahead. Unexpected deceleration. Hour reacts. Too late. Contact. Not dramatic. Not catastrophic. But enough to trigger a response. And that response followed the rulebook perfectly. 3 positions. No debate. No adjustment. No context. And that's where the problem begins. Because Nürburgring doesn't follow normal logic. It never has. This isn't a circuit where positions are just numbers on a screen. They're conditions. They define the environment you enter. They determine how much risk you're forced to take before you even touch the wheel. And suddenly, Verstappen, who had done nothing wrong, is no longer starting near clean air. He's being dropped into traffic. Dense traffic. Unpredictable traffic. The kind of traffic where races don't unfold smoothly, they break apart. But here's the detail most people missed. The penalty didn't just change where the car started. It changed who the car would be racing against in the opening phase. Different cars. Different pace. Different behavior. And that matters more than anything. Because early in a Nürburgring race, the field isn't spread out. It's compressed. Tight. Unstable. Every car fighting for position. Every driver reacting instead of controlling. And when you place a top-level machine into that environment, the dynamics shift instantly. More overtakes required. More risk taken. More moments where everything depends on perfect timing. And on this track, perfect timing doesn't exist. Even Verstappen has said it himself. There is no perfect lap here. No perfect execution. Only survival. Corner after corner. Lap after lap. Now add one more layer to this. This wasn't an isolated incident. Earlier in the season, he dominated a race and lost everything after the finish. A technical violation. A rule applied after the fact. Once again, performance wasn't enough. Once again, the system stepped in. And once again, the consequence didn't feel proportional to what actually happened. A pattern begins to emerge. Not obvious. Not loud. But there. Small decisions. Large outcomes. And Verstappen, repeatedly, ends up carrying the weight of them. But this time, the environment made it different. Because this wasn't about points. This wasn't about standings. This was Nürburgring. Where every position changes your exposure to risk. Where every decision alters the probability of something going wrong. And that's the key word. Probability. The penalty didn't guarantee anything. It didn't cause the crash. But it shifted the odds. It moved the car closer to danger. Closer to the kind of situation where one mistake doesn't stay isolated. It spreads. And that's exactly what makes the next part impossible to ignore. Because once the race began, those probabilities didn't stay theoretical. They became real. The race begins. Engines rise. The tension that had been building all day finally releases. But something feels off. Because this isn't a clean start. This is Nürburgring. And Nürburgring never gives you clean starts. Cars launch forward, but instead of spreading out, they compress. Immediately. Faster machines trying to break free. Slower cars holding their line. Different categories mixing in ways that don't feel natural. And within seconds, the field becomes a moving puzzle with no clear pattern. Now remember where that Mercedes was placed. Not at the front. Not in clean air. Right in the middle of it all. Surrounded. Forced to react instead of dictate. And that changes everything. Because in this phase of the race, control is an illusion. You're not driving your ideal line. You're adapting. Constantly. Every corner becomes a decision. Every straight becomes a risk calculation. Close the gap or hold back. Commit or wait. And while all of that is happening, something else builds in the background. Density. Cars getting closer. Groups forming. Moments stacking on top of each other. And then, Klosterdal. One of the fastest sections on the entire track. A place where hesitation doesn't exist. Where every driver is committed before they even arrive. Over 200 kilometers per hour. Minimal margin. No space for correction. And here's where everything breaks. A reaction. Then another. One car slows. Another arrives faster than expected. Then another. And suddenly, it's not one mistake. It's a chain. 7 cars. Caught in the same moment. No escape. No time. Just impact. And then, silence. The race stops. Completely. Red flag. Cars stranded across the track. Debris scattered. A scene that doesn't look like racing anymore. It looks like something went very wrong. And this is where the atmosphere changes instantly. Because within seconds, it's clear this isn't routine. Medical teams are on track. Ambulances moving fast. And then, the helicopter. That detail alone shifts everything. Because when a helicopter is deployed, it means one thing. Urgency. Real urgency. Drivers are injured. Multiple. Details unclear. But serious enough to stop everything. And suddenly, the entire paddock is no longer thinking about the race. They're thinking about consequences. Now pause on that moment. 25 minutes. That's all it took. The race hadn't even settled. Strategies hadn't developed. The field hadn't stretched. Everything was still in that unstable phase. Exactly the kind of phase where being deeper in the grid matters most. Where traffic is at its worst. Where reactions replace control. And this is where the connection becomes impossible to ignore. Because the crash didn't happen late. It didn't come after hours of racing. It happened right at the point where positioning defines exposure. Where being surrounded increases risk. Where one small disruption doesn't stay contained, it spreads. And that's exactly what happened. But here's the detail that changes the tone completely. One of the cars didn't just crash. It went under the safety barriers. That's not supposed to happen. That's beyond a normal racing incident. That's the system being pushed past its limits. And when you hear that, everything feels heavier. Because now, this isn't just about who was involved. It's about how far things escalated. How quickly control was lost. And how little it took for everything to collapse. Now think about Verstappen again. He's not in the car. He's in the garage. Watching. Waiting for his moment. The second stint. The darkness. The challenge he specifically wanted. And instead, he's watching the race disappear in front of him. Lap by lap. Minute by minute. Until there's nothing left. And that creates a strange reality. Because he avoided the crash. But only by timing. Only because he wasn't in the car yet. And that raises a question no one can answer. If the sequence had shifted slightly, if the timing had been different, would he have been there? Would that penalty have placed him directly inside that moment? We don't know. And that's exactly what makes it uncomfortable. Because this isn't about certainty. It's about proximity. How close a decision brought a driver to a situation that spiraled out of control. And once you start seeing it that way, the penalty stops looking small. It starts looking like the first move in a sequence no one fully understood. But the most important part still hasn't been said. Because what came after the crash, what was confirmed later, is what turns this from a racing incident into something much harder to ignore. At first, there was confusion. No clear answers. No full picture. Just fragments. Cars stopped in places they should never be. Marshals running. Medical teams working against time. And a silence that didn't feel normal. Because when motorsport goes quiet like that, it means something serious has happened. Then, slowly, information starts to surface. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Carefully. Controlled. And each new detail makes the situation heavier. 7 cars involved. Multiple drivers injured. A section of track completely blocked. The race suspended indefinitely. But even that wasn't the full story. Because behind the official language, behind the cautious updates, something else was being discussed. Something much harder to process. One of the drivers involved in that crash didn't make it. A fatality. Confirmed later. Quietly. Without the noise that usually surrounds breaking news. And in that moment, everything changes. This is no longer about penalties. No longer about positions. No longer about strategy. This becomes real. Irreversible. And suddenly, the entire narrative shifts. Because now, every detail that led up to that moment carries more weight. Every decision feels heavier. Every consequence feels sharper. And this is where the story becomes impossible to ignore. Because less than 24 hours before the race, Verstappen said something that now feels almost haunting. He acknowledged the risk. He admitted it openly. A serious crash was always possible. And still, he said it was worth it. That he wasn't afraid. Because the challenge, the experience, the intensity of Nürburgring made it worth the danger. At the time, it sounded like confidence. Like the mindset of a champion. Now, it sounds different. Now it feels like a direct confrontation with reality. Because Nürburgring doesn't negotiate. It doesn't adapt. It doesn't care who you are. And on that day, it proved it again. A driver with decades of experience. A regular at this circuit. Still caught in a moment where everything escalated beyond control. And that's the part that hits the hardest. Because if it can happen there? To someone who knows the track? Who understands the risks? Then what does that say about the environment itself? And this is where everything connects back to the beginning. The penalty. The position. The exposure. Not as a direct cause, but as part of a chain. A sequence of decisions and conditions that shaped how the race unfolded. Because motorsport isn't just about what happens. It's about how likely it is to happen. And small changes shift that likelihood. They move drivers closer to risk, or further away from it. And in this case, everything moved in one direction. Toward a moment that no one can undo. Now think about Verstappen again. Sitting in the garage, helmet off, watching the screens. Watching the race disappear. Watching a situation unfold that no driver ever wants to see. And knowing he was part of that race. Part of that grid. Part of that environment. Even if he never got in the car. And that creates something difficult to process. Because physically, he was safe. But mentally, he was right there. Inside that moment. And that's why this penalty feels different. Not because it broke the rules. Not because it was illegal. But because of what it represents. A system making decisions in isolation. Without fully accounting for the reality they operate in. Because at most tracks, a 3-place penalty is manageable. Here, it's something else. Here, it can place you closer to something you can't control. And that leads to the final, uncomfortable question. Not about Verstappen. Not about one incident. But about the sport itself. How many decisions are made like this? Every weekend? Without anyone stopping to ask what they truly change? Because if this moment has shown anything, it's that the consequences of a decision are not always visible when it's made. Sometimes, you only understand them when it's already too late.